Hi there, welcome to Survive the Jive. I'm not sure how the stream's looking right now because I'm trying a new way of streaming. YouTube's changed its streaming stuff, but basically I just wanted to do an impromptu stream because I wanted to do a deep dive into this important subject based on a new genetic research paper that's been released on the subject of Viking Age DNA. And I anticipate a lot of the media are going to spin this and talk about how diverse the Vikings were. And that's kind of like, that's what you can anticipate very soon will be done. So just to, anticipate that, I want to give you the skinny on what's really in this paper and what it really shows about Viking Age DNA. And actually, it's a really interesting paper. It's really cool. So, where do I begin? Well, the short answer is, it's not actually that surprising what we find inside it. Like, there's pretty much a lot of stuff being confirmed that historical sources already indicated anyway. But there's also some kind of curveballs that we weren't expecting. Someone says, Spensiferous says, stop calling them Vikings. Thanks for the super chat, Spensiferous, but actually Vikings is the correct word for what we're talking about. This paper is only about Vikings. It's not about the Norse as an overall people, as an ethnic group. It's about Vikings, which means raiders. So it's only looking at the DNA of raiding parties and their families in their respective colonies. So you're wrong, actually. Viking is the correct word to use now. So just how diverse were they? Well, I'm going to give you, I'll go through some of the papers and stuff as well, and look at what those show. But basically, the first thing that we see when we looking at this paper is that the Nordic regions can be grouped in the Viking Age. Looking at Viking Era Dna, and they've got a few samples from the Viking era. They've also got some Nordic Bronze Age samples. They've got some Iron Age Nordic samples. And the Viking Age samples aren't all from Scandinavia. Some of them are from Salma in Estonia, for example, where there was a large burial of lots of Swedish Vikings. And there's also Viking burials in Scandinavia, in Britain, in the British Isles, in Ireland, and in Orkney Islands, and in Iceland, and in Greenland. So the Viking era ones aren't all from Scandinavia. That's why they're all Vikings. And then the earlier ones, like Nordic Bronze Age and stuff, are Scandinavian, and that's how they use as reference point to see how genetics in Scandinavia of Scandinavian people changed from the course of from the late Neolithic through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and into the Viking era. Well, by the Viking era, the genetics of Scandinavia and of Nordic people can be grouped into three rough groups, which they call Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish. And that corresponds pretty much to what we now consider to be those nations, although what southern Sweden is part of the Danish cluster. And that makes sense because that part of Sweden was actually, until quite recently in history, part of Denmark. What's also interesting is that these differences, these clusters, are based mainly on differing proportions of Neolithic, of pre-existing admixture from the three founding populations of the Neolithic that were already in play in the late Neolithic. So nothing new being added to add that differentiation, except for a little bit of Asian DNA from Sami, but that's not widespread throughout Scandinavian and Norse people. It's just a thing that's found in some Norse people. But basically the groups are Neolithic farmer with that Middle Eastern component, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, which includes the Western hunter-gatherers like Cheddarman and the Eastern hunter-gatherers, and also the Indo-European DNA from the steppe. And what they've found is that over the course of the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, the proportion of Neolithic farm ancestry in Scandinavians went down, and the level of hunter-gatherer ancestry, even though there were no hunter-gatherers anymore, increased, as did the level of Indo-European DNA. I think that the reason the hunter-gatherer DNA was increasing is because the Indo-Europeans were carrying in more of it. But that doesn't say that in the paper. That's just a conclusion I've made. But yeah, then later on, during the Viking era, you see a slight amount of Neolithic ancestry increasing, especially in Malmo and southern Sweden, that kind of places, where trade with southern Europe is having some influence, but not very significant. Overall, it's still very, very much Yamnaya, dominated ever since the Bronze Age. And really what we can say is that basically Scandinavian people come to existence as we now know them in the Bronze Age, and that all the subsequent events of the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and the Viking Age and medieval times just reshuffle and group the ancient proportions in slight amounts that aren't significant. So in that sense, they're not diverse. They're very homogeneous people, and some regions are very homogeneous. But the term homogeneous is relative to what? Like some areas of Scandinavia are more homogeneous than others. Like central Norway is identified as a place that's more homogeneous than the coastal areas of Norway. But even the central Norwegians have pre-Anglo-Saxon British DNA. So that shows that, and British DNA, it shows in the paper, is found in all around Scandinavia, especially in trading centres like Gotland, which is an island in Sweden, but also in parts of Western Scandinavia, that's Western Denmark, and a lot in Norway. So everyone in Norway, in modern Norwegians, is 12 to 25% British, and that is not. Some of that includes pre-Anglo-Saxon British DNA. So that's not just that because the Anglo-Saxons had a language that was mutually intelligible to a certain extent with Old Norse, so that they were able to trade, and we can expect to see some Anglo-Saxons up there in Scandinavia trading. But we're more surprised to see that this stuff was happening before the Anglo-Saxon era. So this DNA had entered Scandinavia before the Viking era, probably, and British DNA was widespread there, and also. The term British DNA is not just meaning English, it can mean Scotland as well. These three genetic clusters of Scandinavians, that's Sweden, Norway and Danish, these also pretty much the same today when we use the terms of the nations Norway, Sweden and Denmark. It gives the example of Norway is 45 to 65% the same as the Norwegian Viking era cluster. So it's pretty much the same. So they're quite ancient clusters, which is more like reinforcing just how homogeneous everything was back then. Oh, the box. Do you want me to get rid of the box? People complaining about the box. Get out there. I'll put it in the corner. I won't go into the settings to get rid of it. Hey, it's gone, right? You happy now? Someone said it's modern art. Okay, everyone can stop spurging about the box now, and I'll get back to talking about Viking DNA. Norway as a nation is a modern nation, of course, and Sweden controlled Norway for a bit, Denmark controlled Norway for a bit, but actually the notion of Norwegian separateness as a cluster, it's actually quite ancient. They have a slight unique genetic profile. Now, the Viking Age, Viking Age is in England. What we've found about now, we know that there's separate Viking, DNA for Denmark, Norway, Sweden. That means we can look at Viking DNA and see where the Vikings came from with some degree of accuracy. And the Vikings in England basically all mainly come from Denmark. And people will say, well, that's what we thought anyway, because the Old English called them Danes. But actually, the term Danes didn't mean Denmark, it meant Scandinavians, because as I say, the modern nations of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway didn't exist in the medieval times, as we now understand them. So, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? But here's the problem. Even, they said this for a while in other previous studies, we cannot tell the difference between Anglo-Saxon DNA and Danish Viking DNA. And that's because the majority of Anglo-Saxon DNA comes from Denmark. And some people say, yeah, but actually, many of the Saxon tribes come from Germany. Well, what you've got to understand is that if you look at like a classical era, like if you go to the Roman era and look at German DNA then is basically like Danish DNA now. Germans today aren't the same as classical Germania, because the Germanic tribes came from Scandinavia into Germany and gradually became more and more like Central Europeans that inhabit Germany today. So the modern inhabitants of Germany are kind of the same as genetically similar to what the people were like in Germany before the Germanic invasions, actually, because they've leveled out. But the if you look at Anglo-Saxon DNA, like the Anglo-Saxons, like when you get a pure Anglo-Saxon DNA, they don't plot among modern Germans. They plot among modern Danish people, because even though when they come from Germany, those people were basically like genetically like Germans, like Danes, sorry. So, and then also the Angles themselves and the Jutes come from what's now modern day Denmark. So of course the Anglo-Saxons are basically Danish people. And then a few hundred years later, many hundred years later, you get the Viking Age starting, and they're Danes too. And of course, it makes sense that it's pretty, very much impossible to distinguish how much Anglo-Saxon DNA we have. The only way they can try and do it, they haven't said in this paper, but I'd assume that the length of segments somewhat is influenced by what the length of the segments of DNA is somewhat influenced by when those were introduced into that genome. So that admixture came in. So, but I don't know if that method of measuring length of segments is actually accurate enough to distinguish between that many centuries. I'm not informed enough about that subject to figure that out. But they don't, always with caution, when anyone says they tell you how much Viking DNA or how much Anglo-Saxon DNA you have, always approach it with caution, because they may be just fluffing it, because they really can't tell the difference between Danish and Anglo-Saxon. But what they say is that since there's they can consistently see what Norwegian DNA is like, and in Britain, it's around 4% in modern day Britain, and they presume that the Danish Viking DNA is probably going to be somewhere between 4 and maybe as much as 16%. So then you've got that. So if it goes as much as 16% Danish, which is the high end, plus the 4% Norwegian, and you've got 20% Viking DNA in some people. But another place has always, another paper has said that Britain can be 20 to 40% Anglo-Saxon. Now, if that was a clear distinguishing between the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons, which it can't really have been, then you might actually, if you added the very top end of that 40% and the very top end of the 20%, well, you've got 60% Scandinavian DNA in British. And that becomes even more confusing than now we know that British DNA, pre-Anglo-Saxon British DNA and Anglo-Saxon DNA also exist in Scandinavia. So when people say like on your 23andMe, this is Scandinavian DNA, this is British DNA, it's not 100%. You can't trust it that easily, because they can't distinguish these things that easily. They're very, very closely related. And there's so much overlap between those two places on both sides. So conversely, while the Danes came to England, the Viking DNA in Ireland and Iceland and Greenland and the Isle of Man is mainly Norwegian, which is quite interesting, isn't it? So you can see that the Norwegians were dominating the Celtic countries and Iceland, whereas the Danes were dominating the West Germanic parts of Britain. Oh, I've got someone says he likes Cossacks better than Vikings. Vikings are overrated. Well, those are different eras, so I don't know what the relevance of that point is, but thanks for your opinion. Spensiferous says, you have a box on your face, lad. Check the output. Yeah, okay, sorry, I've done that now, yeah. Thank you both for your super chats. Back to the topic at hand. So another thing is they did look at some Vikings in England, some Viking DNA in England, expecting it to be a Danish Viking, but actually even the Vikings themselves in England had British DNA. So the idea of the Vikings coming on the boat and then raiding, it's not 100% true. Like some Vikings who'd come to Britain, interbred with Britons, continued and had children who were part British and part Viking or part Norse, continued to be ethnically Norse and to raid their surrounding cousins of English descent, even though the Vikings had that. So like there is just a certain degree to which whether you're a Norse is determined by culture, and your British heritage wouldn't stop that. But we kind of expected this anyway, because we known that the Danelaw had this interbreeding for a long time. So that's not too too surprising. Although I believe that one of the Vikings that's talking about who had this British DNA is near Oxford, which is actually just south of the Danelaw. It's just on the border of the Danelaw. So, what about the Swedes? What about the Swedes, eh? Well, actually it says that the Vikings in the East Baltic, like, for example, the Salma burial, which was discovered quite recently. I think it was it uncovered in 2008, 2009? Anyway, the DNA analysis is more recent, but there was a big burial. Basically, some Swedish Vikings went there. It was already thought they were Swedish because that's the most closest place to Salma. It's an island off the coast of Estonia. They all got like BTFO'd by some Finno-Ugric Estonians, basically, that they tried to raid, and there was a big burial of them. And that what's shown is that these Swedish Vikings had actually admixture from Finland and the Baltic. So while the Baltic and the Finnish areas where the Vikings were settled were, of course, Swedes going into the Finland and the Baltic, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland. There's also some backflow of that DNA. And trade centre like Gotland is very interesting because not only is there British DNA there, because it's some Britain come all the way to Gotland to do trading, but also there's a lot, maybe less surprisingly, of Finnic DNA and Baltic DNA. But actually, if you go to Gotland and look in the museums, what you see is that the Bronze Age culture of Gotland was less like the Nordic Bronze Age of Scandinavia, and sort of like a fusion between Baltic Bronze Age and Nordic Bronze Age. So the Baltic links of Gotland are, very old. They go right back. So it's not that surprising that you'd see a more diverse signal on Gotland. It's maybe more surprising to see British DNA on Gotland. I was surprised. But then later, if you look at like modern people in Gotland are different from Swedes because Gotland was part of the Hanseatic League, which was a trading empire across the Baltic, run by Germans mainly. So they're going to have that continental thing. But we can see that even going back to the Bronze Age, Gotland has been an exceptional case. And also, maybe more surprisingly, as I said, Swedes have some Finnic admixture, and we maybe would have seen that more from the Swedish, the days of the golden era of the Swedes, which is when they had an empire which included Finland. But now we see actually the Vikings themselves also had a bit of that Finnish interbreeding with Finns. But this is what they're going to term this diversity. But really, bear in mind, if you go from a British Celt to a Finnish or an Estonian, they're all white and they're all not that different, to be honest. And this is the very greatest extent of the diversity they're going to see. And even this diversity in those times isn't actually that widespread. I mean, most of the people are quite homogeneous. So it's, some Vikings had a bit of British DNA, some had a bit of Baltic DNA. If you put a Lithuanian, an Englishman, and a Swede next to each other, they're all pretty much similar, aren't they? They're all white Northern Europeans. So that don't fall for whatever the papers tell you about how the Vikings were super diverse, because they weren't. Someone says, Jonathan Waller says, when Doggerland was about, would this have been influence on Old Norse DNA? No, Doggerland only existed in the hunter-gatherer era. So the Norse didn't exist. As I said, the Neolithic DNA in Scandinavia is like that Middle Eastern style DNA, but that's after Doggerland sunk. So the Neolithics come in, and then they're not really Nordic people, what we think as Norse people, the Neolithics, because they have more of a Southern European profile. It's what we think of as the Nordic people come around with the corded ware culture, with the introduction of steppe DNA. And that's a long time after Doggerland sunk, so it's got nothing to do with it. So Doggerland has no relevance to this conversation about Nordic people. The people who lived on Doggerland were probably just Western hunter-gatherers like Cheddar Man. So, what else did we see? What about Orkney? People say, when I said that about the Isle of Man, that was mainly Norwegian people. Iceland, maybe Norwegian people. Ireland, Norwegian Vikings coming there. But then everyone's going to say, well, Orkney. Well, Orkney is interesting because they had a look at a couple of Vikings there who were 85% non-Norse. That means 85% local. And the people in the paper speculate that this may be Pictish DNA, which is interesting because we don't really know what Pictish people, we don't know much about who the Picts were, whether they were Celts or what. But if we can say that this 85% of local DNA in Orkney is authentic Pictish DNA, then that's quite interesting. But they had a bit of Norse DNA. But what that shows again is that they were culturally Nordic. They were Norse. There was like Orkney wasn't part of Scotland. It wasn't part of Britain. It was considered part of Norway. And the people there had minority amount of Norwegian ancestry, some of them, but there were still Vikings, Norse. So it's possible to have a lot of non-Norse DNA and be a Viking, in the case of the Orcadians at least. Gene flow within the Viking world was not like random. This is another thing they found. It's not like this is a big Viking empire and they're all like interbreeding. No, most of the gene flow is coming from Denmark outwards into the provinces. So Denmark is the dominant Viking cultural center, and the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Icelanders are peripheries from which Danish DNA radiates into. So most of that is everyone else getting Danified rather than any other gene flow. The British DNA is also found, as I said, I've covered that. So the British DNA is quite widespread in Scandinavia, actually, especially Denmark and Norway, but also in some parts southwest. They found a bit in southwest Sweden and a bit in Gotland. So that's very interesting. So the ties between the British and the Scandinavian peoples are very strong both ways. And as I said, Norwegians still 12 to 25% British. That's quite surprisingly a high amount. But that could be, the high amount could be from subsequent post-Viking Age interactions, because fishermen have always been going back and forth to Norway, and you never know what the odd fisherman coming ashore to these port towns, maybe a handsome British sailor might, take a little bit of time off on Bergen and see and interact with the lovely Norwegian maids there. I once took a little trip to Oslo myself and acquainted myself with the Norwegian girls. Very enjoyable British pastime. Viking raiders, another really interesting thing. We can't say, and some people will class this like this thing, Vikings were multicultural and they just interbred with everyone. That's not true. They do interbreed with some peoples, as we've seen. When the Norse, in two different models here can be seen, or three in the paper in total, if I broadly classify it. One, we can see the English model, where a lot of Vikings settle and influence the DNA a lot, but over time they become localized and become English. An alternative and opposite model is like the Orkneys, where some Vikings come, and even though they're outnumbered by the local populace, everyone becomes Nordified. So the Orcadians are culturally Nordic, but genetically still mainly Orcadian. Whereas in England, there was parts where they were, the opposite happened, where they eventually became culturally English, even though they had a significant amount of Nordic DNA. And then the third model is what we see in Greenland, where they had these Viking settlements up in Scandinavia, up in far north, touching the American continent. Well, they had absolutely no evidence of any interbreeding with Native Americans, Inuit, Eskimos, whatever you want to call them, up there, which indicates one of two things. Either one, they refused to intermix with Native Americans for whatever, maybe racial reasons, or two, they did intermix with them, but those mixed race children were only allowed to live among the Native Americans and not among the Vikings, because the Vikings did not have any of that DNA come in there. So you can surmise which of those you consider to be more likely. There has in the past been speculation that there was Native American DNA in Iceland, indicating that some slaves were brought back, or wives, Native American wives, but there's not very much in Iceland, so it certainly wouldn't be a great amount. And bear in mind that even if there was just one woman brought back to Iceland, you would still be able to see that in the Icelandic gene pool, because Iceland has a small gene pool. So, for example, in Iceland, a couple of hundred years ago or something, there was a black guy there, and he, I don't know what he was doing there, but a black guy went there, and he had children with an Icelandic woman, and those then had children, and they all integrated, until you can't notice that anyone has any black ancestry. But in modern Icelandic DNA, they have reconstructed the entire genome of that black man, because so many people have just that little tiny bit of that DNA from that one black guy, and it's such a small genome in Iceland, such a gene pool in Iceland, that they can actually reconstruct the entire genome of one human being, and it stands out. Like looking in the segments, they can see, oh, this is uniquely sub-Saharan African DNA, so they know, and it's only one guy. So it's interesting. Iceland could see, you can see that kind of thing when you look at Icelandic DNA. That's interesting. That's the useful thing about having this isolated population, that you can do some interesting genetic analysis. One other really insightful thing that we found out about them from this, specific looking at the Salma burials in Estonia, but also others around and about, is that the Viking raiders were often related to the guys in their boat. So in the case of Salma, it says it was a high class aristocratic kinship group had gone to Estonia and got killed by Estonians. They were like, a lot of them related, and even they're looking at, like in Britain, a lot of the time they can see that the Vikings in the boats are like third or fourth cousins. So when they say kinsmen, they really mean kinsmen. Like the guys rowing with the boats with them are really like blood brothers. They're actually very closely related. So when we say they're diverse, they're not really diverse at all. Like if you look at a Viking boat, not only are they all probably pretty much of one race, well, they are definitely one race, they're all white. Not only are they all 100% Northern European, they may have a little bit of British admixture, but they're actually all like cousins. So they really have that like strengthened sense of camaraderie from knowing that their sword brother, their shield brother is actually their brother, their father, their cousin, their third cousin. I think that's really gives us a great insight into the actual culture of the Vikings, because we couldn't actually confirm that until we had this DNA evidence. The Wabanaki tribe, someone says. I don't know what that is, Svet, but thank you for the £2 donation. Well, going back to the other findings, what else have we got? Some interesting stuff. Lactose tolerance was very rare in Europe in the Neolithic. It starts to become common because it's spread by Indo-Europeans, and then among the corded ware culture it's still not that common, but once Indo-European culture comes in, you see evidence of a lot more milk drinking, like people producing milk. But that's weird, because most people even in the Bronze Age, not just in late Neolithic corded ware, but even going into the Nordic Bronze Age, most people are not lactose tolerant yet. We see that there are lactose tolerant genes, and they're becoming more and more common. And this is probably because people start drinking more milk, eating more butter, and like so many of them are getting diarrhea or whatever and not surviving, that the guys who can actually have this gene that lets them drink milk and get really big and strong are just getting, they're dominating, having more children, and gradually we see it getting more and more to the point of the Viking Age where it's much more common. So we can see that that process, beginning with the Indo-European invasions, going right into the Viking Age, of everyone becoming more and more lactose tolerant, or the increase of lactase persistence is another way of saying it. So milk is very Indo-European, and Vikings, milk drinking, big lads, strong, very Indo-European. There's also some talk about height in this paper. I can't remember the findings on that. You'll have to go over it yourself. But here, what I really found interesting was it talks about phenotype. What we think of as the Nordic phenotype is based on what we see now as more common in Scandinavia than elsewhere. And of course, I don't have to tell you, the stereotype is blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, does that mean that all the Vikings were blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and that has now subsequently been lessened in Scandinavia by admixture with non-Scandinavians? No. That's a nonsense, and this has proven it conclusively. The prevalence of blonde hair and blue eyes in the Viking Age was pretty much exactly the same as it is in modern Scandinavians. So there are, some blondes, some blue-eyed people, and some also not. There's got black-haired Vikings, brown-haired Vikings, brown-eyed Vikings. It's just like modern-day Sweden. There's some people blonde, some people aren't. So don't get really silly about everyone looking the same. There's never been a culture where everyone has identical, there's never been a uniformly blonde population. It's just not how it happened. Blondism has spread, and it's most successfully spread in Scandinavia, among Scandinavians, and it's never been more successful in any population than it is among modern Scandinavians as a phenotype. So those are the main cool things in the paper. I think the other thing I should do is well, I guess I could what's this? Oh, Brandon Fisher, $10. Thank you very much, Brandon. Finally making enough money to donate. Tons of love and appreciation for your work and good example. Thanks a lot, Brandon. I really appreciate the donation and the kind words. So on this new method of streaming, I want to find out how I can do a screen share, because then I can show you some of the balls. Well, I guess I can't do it. Sorry about that. Well, basically, there's some really cool charts and stuff that just show everything I've shown. Like, there's one chart specifically that shows which areas of Britain and Scandinavia belong to which of the genetic clusters of the Scandinavians. That's really interesting. And there's another, and that map you can also see it doesn't actually talk about Norman DNA in this paper. Someone asked me on Twitter, were the Normans Norwegians or Danes? I always assumed that the Normans were Norwegians, but the paper doesn't admittedly look at that at any Viking DNA. It doesn't mention any samples from Normandy, but one of the maps indicates that the northern France is part of the Danish cluster and not the Norwegian cluster. Now, I don't know if that map is 100% accurate. Maybe they just fluffed it. Like, sometimes maps in scientific papers aren't like, 100%. But maybe that's it. Yeah, go into the paper and look at that stuff. But anticipate that in the papers, coming weeks, there will be headlines. Vikings were super diverse. They were, they didn't have any idea of purity, and they were all actually really diverse. No, they weren't. They were one of the most genetically homogeneous peoples in the world. You can't, and the only people that they have admixture from are neighbouring peoples who were genetically very similar. That is, Brits to the west, Baltics to the east. It's what you'd expect. Every population in the entire world has some amount of admixture from its neighbours. That's just normal. Of course, British people have Scandinavian admixture. Of course, British people have French admixture. They're their neighbours. Of course, Scandinavians have British and Baltic admixture. That's their neighbours. Neighbours are always the ones who people have admixture from, and it can be sometimes significant, sometimes negligible. In this case, it varies according to different parts of Scandinavian history. But certainly, we can see not only can we identify a Scandinavian genetic type, we can identify subtypes within that Norwegian cluster, Swedish cluster, Danish cluster. So that shows that there is significant amount of homogeneity for us to identify, sub-regional levels of Scandinavian ancestry, even though the Scandinavians were never a particularly populous area. There have never been a lot of Nordic people. Even today, Scandinavians there aren't that many of them. The countries are quite sparsely populated. Well, I think I've covered all of it, and there's no need for me to waffle on unnecessarily. I just wanted to cover this. To let you know, coming up, I've got a video on British Roman Britain. I went to a couple of Roman British sites and filmed some cool stuff there, and I'll edit it all together and as soon as I can, but I've been quite busy this summer. And that's about all I have to say, unless any of you have any questions before I finish. Someone says, some people making assertions, they're saying, instead of saying what's based on the paper, they say X was X based on what I've previously believed. What you have to understand is a lot of what we expect, but what we think we know is based only on historical records, which even when they're 100% truthful, like someone says the Danes came here on this date, that doesn't mean that other things didn't happen that weren't recorded. Like if we say that the Danes invaded Essex on this day, that doesn't mean Norwegians didn't also come, because we don't have a 100% record. But if we see the DNA, that's 100%. That's not like one medieval chronicler and his biases. That's a scientific evidence, especially if it's in ancient DNA. Someone says here, this guy, Hale and Pace, by 1066, Normans were 50% Viking and 50% French in Britain. How do you know that? What? There's never been a paper on Norman DNA. You've just pulled that completely out of nowhere. You assert that, but you have no way of knowing that. The 50-50 figure is completely arbitrary. I suspect that basically by 1066, you're talking 3 generations since the Vikings invaded Normans. 3 generations is not very much. And also, there's a consistent interactions with the Norse for a while before the Vikings don't just come to Norway and Normandy and then stop. So it could be a lot more than 50% Viking. Maybe it's less than 50% Viking. I don't know. But I will know when they do an analysis of Viking DNA from Normandy. I'll know more. I'll be able to tell more about that. But they haven't done that. So instead of saying pretending you know something you don't know, just say that you don't know or you suspect this based on X. That's the good way to talk about it. Well, anyway, I think one thing's for certain. We can say that British DNA is awesome and widespread in Scandinavia, and if there's anything good about Scandinavians, it's probably down to the residual British DNA that they picked up from their natural British masters. And I look forward to the day when all of Europeans once more bow and bend the knee to their rightful master, British. God save the Queen, and good night.